Today we are going to learn in this module about some of the following things. After studying this module, you shall be able to know elements of effective regulation. You would also be able to learn about the structure of regulatory institutions. You would be able to identify differences between cost-plus regulation and price cap regulation. Also be able to analyze more practical regulation of infrastructure services. Let me introduce the subject to you. I am sure you know that many infrastructure activities in developing and transition economies already involve substantial competition, but others have little or none, though that may soon change. For two main reasons, industries lacking competition require regulation. First, to ensure fair treatment of customers who lack the protection that comes with competition. Second, to ensure that competitors have fair access to bottleneck network facilities controlled by incumbent service providers. If incumbents do not face regulatory constraints, they can use these facilities to control or destroy their rivals. Thus, regulation plays a central role in subjecting network utilities to competition. Governments also have a permanent role in enforcing anti-monopoly and antitrust policies which ensure that competition is not suppressed by private monopoly power or by collusion among or combinations of competitors. So no one member of this competition or group be able to monopolize the service. That is the main idea behind this. So one of the biggest challenges for policymakers in developing and transition economies is managing the shift from state ownership and control of infrastructure operations to more independent regulatory oversight. So how do we do it? Let us look at the evolution and elements of effective regulation. Credible, stable regulation is required to achieve the benefits of privatizing and liberalizing infrastructure. Many developing and transition economies, they lack the institutional prerequisites for effective regulation, including the separation of powers, especially between the executive and the judiciary, also the well-functioning and credible political and economic institutions and an independent judiciary, also a legal system that safeguards private property from state or regulatory seizure without fair competition or fair compensation, and relies on judicial review to protect against regulatory abuse of basic principles of fairness. It also lacks norms and laws supported by institutions that delegate authority to a bureaucracy and enable it to act relatively independently. Also, strong contract laws and mechanisms for resolving contract disputes. Similarly, sound administrative procedures that provide broad access to the regulatory process and make it transparent, and also sufficient professional staff trained in relevant economic, accounting and legal principles. So some of these are the drawbacks. Let us see what are the institutional requirements. The structure and process of infrastructure regulation determine how effectively it supports reforms and promotes efficiency and other social objectives. So we need coherence. What is it? Regulations for each infrastructure sector should be complementary and mutually supportive. The laws guiding regulations must be in agreement and regulations must be consistent over time. Regulatory coherence requires that national regulators, ministries and provincial and municipal regulators have clearly defined responsibilities, ensuring that the same agency always makes decisions involving specific aspects of regulations. It is not that today one agency is doing and tomorrow another agency is making laws on this or regulating the same aspects. We also need independence. So effective regulation requires that regulators be largely free from political influence, especially on a day-to-day or decision-by-decision basis. Compromise is needed to ensure that regulators are both independent and responsive to an elected administration's policy goals. However, safeguards that can help achieve such compromise are required, and they include giving the regulator statutory authority, free of ministerial control, similarly setting clear professional criteria for appointing regulators, also requiring that both the executive and legislative branches participate in appointments, and appointing regulators for fixed periods and prohibiting their removal without clearly defined causes, subject to obviously formal reviews. Also, we need staggering the terms of an agency's board members so that they can be replaced only gradually by successive administrations. We also need funding agency operations with user fees or levies on service providers to insulate agencies from political interference through the budget process. Also, exempting agencies from civil service salary caps to enable them to attract and retain well-qualified staff. Also, we need prohibiting the executive branch from overturning an agency's decisions except through new legislation or judicial appeals of existing laws. That will cover some kind of the powers of the executive. Then we also need accountability. So let us discuss about this accountability in this section. A regulator's independence should be reconciled with its accountability. It is difficult to strike a proper balance between independence and accountability, but certain measures can help in this direction. For example, writing statutes that specify the rights and responsibilities of each regulatory agency and distinguish between primary and secondary objectives when there are multiple goals. Similarly, subjecting agency decisions to review by courts or another non-political entity, also requiring regulators to produce annual reports on their activities and subjecting their performance to formal reviews by independent auditors or some legislative committees. Similarly, we also need removing regulators that act inappropriately or incompetently. We also need to allow stakeholders to submit their views on matters under review and requiring regulators to publish their decisions and the reasons behind them. Maybe these are some of the important considerations we have to keep in mind. Now, along with it, we also need transparency. So what is transparency and why does it require and what do we mean by it? Infrastructure regulation is an important policy issue, and therefore in a democracy all citizens need transparent information about it to evaluate government performance. Similarly, we also need predictability. Regulatory agencies are predictable if they follow the rules of law, particularly respect for precedent and the principle of stare decisis. Respect for precedent means that regulators reverse past decisions only if they have created significant problems. Stare decisis require that cases with the same underlying facts be decided the same way every time, which means there should be a consistency in decision making. Thus, regulatory decisions must be based on durable rules and procedures that will apply in future cases unless new information is obtained. Next, we also need capacity. A regulatory agency's responsibilities should match its financial and human resources. Available financing reflects the government willingness to support independent regulatory institutions. But with the possible exception of very small and poor countries, lack of financial capacity is unlikely to be a genuine constraint, though failure to provide adequate financing for regulation is a more common problem. Let us now move on to the structure of regulatory institutions. Centralized or decentralized, what kind of a structure is good? Designing regulation involves trade-offs. For example, decentralization, which means making lower levels of government responsible for regulating utilities, offers several advantages. What are these? These are the following. First, it allows local conditions and preferences to shape regulations. Then it also moves regulators closer to services, allowing them to gather better information on users. Similarly, it promotes competition among sub-national regulators to attract private investment. It also improves enforcement of regulatory decisions. But it also has disadvantages. Similarly, centralization also has advantages. What are these? A national regulatory structure makes the best use of scarce expertise and minimizes the fixed costs of regulations, such as those of maintaining regional offices in a decentralized structure. Centralization can also reduce the risks of a regulatory race to the bottom, which is as when jurisdictions competing for investment take on excessive financial risk or lower their environmental standards. And centralization may be necessary if jurisdictions are too small to support an efficient scale or scope of operations for certain industries. So in a small setup, the centralization may be more useful and economical. Now, analysis of the costs and benefits of either approach must reflect the country's institutional structure and the industry's technological features. Still, several general conclusions can perhaps be drawn. The first could be that small or poor countries may have only one effective tier of government. Large or rich countries have far greater potential for decentralization and more options in assigning different regulatory tasks to different tiers of government. But while multi-layered approaches are the norm in large industrial countries, they increase the complexity of establishing new systems in developing and transition economies. The second is that spillovers across jurisdictions and industry boundaries depend on the industry. So should we have multiple agencies or just one is another question. Let us discuss and understand this. If regulatory responsibilities are assigned to a single tier of government, the government creates industry-specific regulators or a single agency with a broader mandate. Now, establishing separate agencies has some of the advantages. It recognizes the unique economic and technological characteristic of each infrastructure industry and enables regulators to develop industry-specific expertise. It also mitigates the risk of institutional failure and encourages innovative responses to regulatory challenges. But there are also benefits to using just one regulator for several industries. Now, doing so makes it possible to share fixed costs and also scarce talent and other resources. Consolidation also builds expertise in cross-cutting regulatory issues. For example, administering tariff adjustment rules, introducing competition in monopolistic industries, and managing relationships with stakeholders. So, deciding on the breadth of regulatory coverage involves numerous considerations, and no single approach will suit all circumstances. So, let us now go into more details. First, in economies with a small base of consumers, not necessarily population, and limited human and financial resources, there is a strong argument for merging regulatory responsibilities. Similarly, second, we can say that regulators in developing and transition economies typically have less discretion than their counterparts in industrial countries. Multi-industry agencies with narrower responsibilities raise fewer concerns about adequate industry focus or potential diseconomies of scale. The third reason or possibility is that if market substitution can occur between the output of regulatory industries, especially between, say, for example, electricity and gas, but also between modes of transportation and telecommunications, economic distortions may arise from inconsistent regulation of common issues. Thus, we have a case for consolidating regulatory responsibility, which may be stronger for some industries. Fourth, the argument could be that the scarcity of expertise and vulnerability to politics and industry captured in developing and transition economies also strengthen arguments for multi-industry regulations. Finally, the different reform strategies place different demands on new regulatory agencies, affecting their ability to develop expertise and maintain focus. One common strategy is therefore staggered reform, where the government reforms utility industries sequentially over time. Now, this strategy allows a new regulatory agency to focus initially on one industry and build up experience. Let us now understand the importance of regulatory commitment. Regulation that can sustain private investment in infrastructure does more than serve the interests of investors. It also promotes competition and increases access to basic services. Now, such regulation must be clear and credible, ensuring investors that regulators are committed to fair, consistent, and sustainable policies and procedures. So, what do we need for this? We need commitment through administrative procedures. In some countries, utility regulation is based on well-defined administrative procedures. These procedures determine how regulatory agencies make substantive decisions and define mechanisms for appealing them. By specifying the institutional environment for decision making, procedural requirements limit regulators' range of policy decisions and so their discretion. Now, second, we need commitment through concession contracts. In some infrastructure sectors, you would know, for example, in telecommunications, electricity generation, gas production, ownership has been transferred to the private sector through outright divestiture. In others, for example, in water and sewerage, transportation, electricity, transmission and distribution, gas transportation and distribution, legal, political, and constitutional restraints have hindered the transfer of ownership to the private sector. So, as a result, many countries have used innovative strategies to facilitate private participation in those sectors. Concession, lease, or affirmage, and to a much lesser extent management contracts have emerged as attractive alternatives to outright privatization. So, privatization is not the only step which can be taken or is taken. A concession contract grants a private company, typically through competitive bidding, the exclusive right to provide a service for a specified period by using existing facilities and developing new ones. Thus, a concession agreement entails only a temporary transfer of assets to the private sector. At the end of the concession period, the assets are transferred back to the public authority. The next is commitment through substantive economic restraints. In this, we are saying that government discretion can be limited by having regulators publicly articulate the basic economic principles that guide their policy decisions, so that we have some kind of a transparency. Now, these principles would allow space for regulation to adapt to changing market conditions and require regulators to, one, refrain from unilaterally imposing policy or rule that changes undercut promised investment value, also refrain from intervening in activities of regulated firms that relate to competitive markets, or at least markets not identified as or monopolies, and similarly it avoids expanding regulatory intervention without demonstrating that the benefits outweigh the costs, also ensure competitive service quality and prices by avoiding privatization deals that result in higher prices than necessary, which allows consumers to challenge deals that result in higher prices in return for higher government revenue, using price cap mechanisms to control regulated monopoly prices. which we can later on discuss in more detail. And it also allows consumers to seek rate adjustments if service quality falls far short of that promised in a privatization agreement. So it is a comprehensive kind of a document. Now, it also provides consumers and suppliers of complementary and substitute services, suppliers of inputs, and investors with signals and incentives for efficient actions by ensuring that prices reflect the value and marginal costs of services, and by giving them the service providers pricing flexibility. It also requires infrastructure monopolists to give rivals open access to their bottleneck facilities at prices with the same markup as competing services sold by these monopolists. It also pays competitively neutral attention to social goals pertinent to each infrastructure sector by targeting subsidies as much as possible and requiring that any surcharges or taxes imposed have equal effects on the prices charged by competing suppliers. Let us now discuss balancing commitment and flexibility in this section 5.4. To encourage efficient performance, a regulatory system must be able to adapt its mandate and rules in response to new challenges, circumstances, information, and experiences. Such flexibility is especially imperative in sectors experiencing rapid technological and market changes. Let me now come to the mechanisms to regulate these prices. There are 5 basic goals that should design the price regulations. What are these? First, the rent extraction, setting rates that strike a socially acceptable compromise between the interests of investors and consumers. That is known as rent extraction. We should try to avoid it. Second is supply side efficiency, which provides signals and incentives for suppliers and investors to increase efficiency. Similarly, we have demand side efficiency, which is providing signals and incentives for efficient consumption of regulated utility services. Then we have the revenue adequacy, allowing regulated firms to earn sufficient revenue to attract needed capital. And last, we have the fairness, which means ensuring that prices are just and reasonable and contribute to universal service goals without creating significant distortions. Now, these goals can all be achieved simultaneously. Indeed, practical regulation entails trade-offs among them. So, 2 alternative mechanisms for regulating prices are Costplus and price caps. This section now would analyze these approaches and their likely implications for pricing policies. So now we will first discuss about the cost-plus regulation. Policymakers have been attracted to this mode of controlling utility behavior because it seems fair to both the regulated firm and its customers. It permits the firm to earn sufficient revenues, including a fair return on its investment, by passing its cost on to consumers through the prices charged. It is also designed to protect consumers from monopolistic pricing distortions. Now, one of the attractions of cost-plus systems is that they are likely to attract investment to a regulated sector because investors know they will recover their operating and investment costs, perhaps with a return that exceeds their cost of capital. Now, these systems shift a variety of firm and market-specific risks to consumers, satisfying the goal of revenue adequacy. Moreover, by holding revenues close to costs, cost-plus systems keep utility services reasonably affordable. These are important considerations given the socio-economic characteristic of many developing and transition economies and their substantial requirements for infrastructure investment. Still, however, cost-plus systems have certain shortcomings. The firm has an incentive to engage in accounting or contrivances and to pad its costs to convince the regulator to approve higher prices. So, some kind of a manipulation of costs is possible and can be done. Now, these systems allow considerable scope, therefore, for such behavior. A range of estimates is possible due to conventions for calculating depreciation, procedures for allocating joint costs between regulated and unregulated outputs, and procedures for calculating capital costs. So, unless the regulator has a well-developed cost accounting system to audit the firm's costs, the firm can misrepresent them. And if that happens, the regulator will set prices too high, frustrating its rent extraction goal, which means the firms would be able to extract rents by setting up higher costs and maybe in a way forcing the regulator to fix up higher prices based on cost plus pricing principle. Moreover, in the presence of asymmetric information about the firm's capabilities and the level of managerial effort and other costs which it must incur to realize a specified level of operating efficiency, a pure cost plus regime distorts the firm's incentive to minimize its cost, even if the regulator has sophisticated auditing technology. This is because the firm is not rewarded for reducing costs. It has no incentive to do so. Therefore, it would not like to minimize the cost. It is getting cost plus pricing. In addition, the firm has incentives to expand its rate base by adopting excessively capital intensive technology, which is also known as the average Johnson effect. So, although consumers pay prices that just cover the firm's costs, such costs may be too high. As a result, rents may accrue to the firm's managers, employees, and input suppliers, undermining supply side efficiency. The tendency of prices to adjust slowly to changing costs, commonly referred to as regulatory lag, restores some of the incentives for efficiency lost under a pure cost plus system. In this, by partly decoupling prices from costs, the regulatory lag imposes penalties for inefficiency and incorrect guesses, and it rewards efficiency by permitting the firm to keep the profits it earns from cutting costs and improving performance. Moreover, regulators in this system normally have the authority to disallow operating and capital costs that they find imprudent or unnecessary. So, this threat of disallowing such costs encourages the firm to make efficient production decisions. Let us now come over to the second system of price setting, which is known as the price cap or incentive regulation. Now, given the weak incentives for productive efficiency under cost plus regulation, many types of incentive-based regulations have been developed. In essence, the regulator delegates certain performance-related decisions to the firm, and the firm's profits depend on its performance as measured by the regulator. So, the regulator is the one who is measuring the performance. Price caps are the main incentive mechanism. Their key purpose is to control the prices, not the earnings of the regulated firm. Thus, this form of regulation does not make explicit use of accounting data. Under price caps, the regulator basically does the following. 1. It defines a set of prices or a weighted average of prices for different services that the firm will be allowed to charge. The firm is free to price at or below these ceilings. So, we have the upper limit and the firms can charge less than or equal to this limit. It also estimates the ability of the firms in the regulated industry to limit cost increases and compares that with firms in other industries. So the regulator basically tries to do some kind of a benchmarking. The estimated differential in productivity between the regulated industry and the rest of the economy is called the X factor. The regulator specifies a formula for adjusting prices or the weighted average price over time to reflect input inflation, easily observable changes in costs beyond the firm's control, and the expected rate of productivity improvement, which we have defined as the X factor. Thus, price cap regulation severs the link between the firm's authorized prices and its realized costs. So, in a typical price cap plan, related services and products are grouped into categories, often referred to as baskets. Alternatively, all services may be bundled in a single basket. You may find that an overall price cap is set for each basket. Now, this index ceilings is usually a weighted average price for all regulated services in the basket. Moreover, the firm can set the price of any service in a basket as long as it does not exceed the index. Ceiling, although restrictions are often imposed on the prices of individual services to protect specific groups of consumers or promote socially important services. Thus, the firm can rebalance its prices over time. In a pure price cap regime, the firm's realized costs and profits do not enter into regulatory contract. Once the index ceiling and its path is set, they are not changed. The firm has strong incentives to pursue cost-reducing innovation, use the lowest cost technology, operate with no waste, and report its costs truthfully. At the same time, consumers are protected because prices do not vary with the firm's reported costs. So you will find that actual price cap regulation, however, is not as straightforward as the theoretical case. Price caps do not last indefinitely. It is standard for a price cap mechanism to be reviewed after a stipulated period, often 3 to 5 years. Now, such a review could lead to a revision of the basic parameters of the price cap formula, such as the X factor or the efficiency factor. If a firm realizes strong earnings under initial regime, the review could also lead to more demanding standards being placed on the firm by raising this X factor. Moreover, unless prohibited by law, the regulator could conduct a full earnings audit to recalibrate prices so that expected future earnings move towards a target rate of return. So while the firm's earnings do not directly affect prices under a pure price cap regime, most price cap plans include provisions for adjusting prices if the rate of returns falls outside a given range. So when strong efficiency gains cause an increase in future productivity offsets, it dulls the firm's incentive to cut costs and improve performance. Now, this reduction in incentives become more pronounced if the price cap regime is reviewed more frequently. Still, the regulator is not supposed to intervene in the firm's pricing decisions during the review period, which means during the review period, the firm has almost a kind of a fixed price cap, implying that the firm has an incentive to cut its cost faster than was envisaged when the X factor was set, because by doing so it can keep the resulting high profits, which it would like to maximize. It also implies that in setting the period between price reviews, there is a trade-off between providing incentives for efficiency, which you may call as supply side efficiency goal, and reducing excess profits, which is known as rent extraction goal. So we find the longer is the period, the greater are the benefits for the firm. The shorter is the period, the greater are the benefits for the consumers, because they do not benefit from cost reductions or until the price cap is reset. Now, very short periods would make the price cap system look like rate of return regulation. There are grounds, however, for expecting a or ratcheting up effect in the price cap system. As the end of the review period approaches, the firm will ease off its cost reducing activities so that the reset caps will reflect its higher costs. So price caps offer regulators a variety of choices. For example, which services will be subject to a price cap? Which services will be used to construct the price index? They also have to decide that will certain cost increase be automatically passed on to consumers, and if so, to what extent. Let us now, which is the hybrid regimes. Most practical regulatory regimes are hybrid schemes that involve trade-offs between supply side efficiency, capital attraction, rent extraction, and demand side efficiency. Now, these mechanisms aim to share cost benefits and burdens between the regulated firm and its customers. For example, under some profit sharing mechanisms, the firm is allowed to keep all profits as long as the rate of return or revenue falls within a specified range. Now, that approach retains incentives for firm to achieve cost efficiency. But if the rate of returns falls outside this range, consumers receive a portion of the gain or loss, weakening the firm's incentives. Overall, therefore, incentives for cost efficiency are stronger under such profit sharing schemes than under rate of return regulation, but are weaker than under price caps. Similarly, institutionalized regulatory lag restores some of the incentives for cost efficiency lost under the rate of return regulation. So how ultimately do we choose between the rate of return and price cap regulation? Let us understand this. From a public policy perspective, I am sure you would know, the choice between the rate of return and the price cap regulation is an empirical question. Let us now, first of all, try to know what is comparative linking of prices to costs. Now, one area where the difference between the two mechanisms has been exaggerated is the extent to which they link prices to costs, and hence there are different implications for the trade-off between incentives for supply side efficiency and rent extraction. Now, under price cap regulation, prices are not linked to costs, and incentives for lowering costs are stronger if the cap is never reset. But that approach is politically untenable if the regulated firm earns extremely high profits at any point. Moreover, nearly every price cap regime is periodically updated at preset intervals. Regulators typically use these updates to eliminate excessive returns and to pass on to consumers through lower prices a portion of the efficiency gains or the firm made in the previous period. Even if the political considerations are discounted, when setting a price cap, the consumer or the price cap, the regulator has to forecast future costs and revenues to ensure that the firm will be financially viable. Otherwise, having no link between prices and costs would bankrupt the firm and disrupt service. Price cap regulation with periodic updates is similar to the rate of return regulation with regulatory lag. Now, Costplus or rate of return regulation, on the other hand, never involves ongoing hearings. The process typically involves periodic reporting of profits and other service measures. Hearings are initiated by firms, regulators, or interested third parties, with firms being the most common source of requests. Inflation is an important determinant of the frequency of review. When inflation is low, reviews are infrequent. When inflation is high, the reviews are quite frequent and are demanded. Let us look at the comparative pricing flexibility. In theory, price cap regulation controls only the firm's average prices, leaving it free to change individual prices in each basket of services. By contrast, prices are rigid under rate of return regulation. But in practice, the difference between the two schemes is not as pronounced. In addition to its overall price control, price cap regulation often limits price changes for individual services. With separate baskets and basket-specific restrictions, price increases in one basket might not be allowed even if they are offset by reductions in another basket. Now, these type of restrictions can severely limit a firm's pricing flexibility under price caps. Moreover, under Costplus regulation, firms have more flexibility in pricing non-core services. They often also have the authority to cut prices and to raise them through automatic adjustment formulas. What is comparative regulatory discretion? Now, price cap reviews give regulators significant discretion over future policies. By contrast, under a rate of return regime, the regulator has a statutory obligation to ensure that the regulated firm earns a fair return. Now, this commitment implies that the rate of return regimes are less prone to renegotiation than price caps. Let's now understand comparative information and human capital requirements. Most developing and transition economies do not have well-established cost accounting and auditing systems. And as noted earlier, they often lack regulatory expertise. Thus, the information and human capital requirements of different regulatory mechanisms are important. Now, given typical inflation rates in these countries, hearings could be common under rate of return regulation. At the end of each review period, price caps require similar information as the rate of return systems. They also require forecasts of variables through the next review. So, setting up and revising price caps requires the same type of professional skills as a rate of return system. But far less professional input is required between reviews. The regulator only has to verify compliance with the price cap by monitoring changes in a well-defined price index. Thus, price cap will likely require much less information overall. In practice, what is the choice? Let's understand this. The optimal choice among regulatory mechanisms depends on a variety of factors: the quality of accounting and auditing systems, the availability of economic and technical expertise, the efficacy of tax system, the sector's investment requirements, the government's commitment powers, the institutional checks and balances, and overall macroeconomic stability. Now, some of these will change over time. I'm sure we all understand this. Thus, what we are saying is that different stages of national development have implications for the choice of regulatory regimes. During the first stage of regulation, with the scarce expertise and poor auditing and monitoring, price caps with provisions for adjustment are likely the best choice. Initial prices might need to be high to attract capital and ensure firm viability, but increased investment and supply side efficiencies should compensate for them. Now, this stage should be used to improve regulatory capacity and accounting and auditing systems. Now, once these conditions have been met, the second stage can promote cost-plus mechanisms that facilitate large-scale and sustainable investment, especially if government credibility improves at a slower pace and achieve the rent extraction goal in the face of continuing high costs of public funds. So, as development continues with the complete infrastructure system expansion and enhanced commitment powers, the optimal solution is to move to hybrid regulation. So, what have we learned today? Let us summarize this. We have learned that regulation that provides a credible commitment to safeguarding the interest of both invested and customers, particularly when economic shocks create political pressure to shift the balance of power among competing interest groups, is crucial to attracting the long-term or private capital needed to secure an adequate, reliable supply of infrastructure services. We have also learned that successful reform requires that regulation that clarifies property rights, allocate them sensibly, and assures private investors that their sunk investment will not be subject to regulatory opportunism. For regulation to promote welfare by facilitating investment, innovation, and allocative efficient pricing, its institutional design and substantive content must be consistent with country circumstances, particularly the country's size, institutional endowments, including checks and balances, and technical expertise, auditing technologies, fiscal condition, and tax system efficacy, and the economic characteristics of its industries. All these are necessary to be kept in mind for any regulator.